What is irregular migration? We often start our conversation with this question. Today we really want to dig in on why the words we use really matters, for how some people as some forms of mobility are constructed as a crisis or as a problem, and how this in turn shape the policy responses of governments and international institutions.
We have two great guests to explore the topic of narratives and discourses on irregularity and their implications. First of all, our ICLAIM colleague, Bastian Vollmer, and Michele Levoy, director of PICUM.
Welcome to Mobility Work and Right, the ICLAIM podcast, where we challenge common misunderstanding about irregular migration in Europe today. I am Nando, a sociologist based at the University of Birmingham in UK, specializing in migration, forced displacement and citizenship.
I'm Ilse van Liempt, a human geographer based at the University of Utrecht in the Netherlands. My work focuses on migration, belonging and citizenship in the spaces of everyday life in Europe. Together we are your hosts for this series.
Our series draws on research from the ICLAIM project, which aims to improve the living and labor condition of irregularized migrant families across Europe. The project is funded by the European Commission Horizon Europe program and UKRI.
In this podcast, we raise the question how discourses and narratives around irregular migration impact the way the general public understands irregular migration, how it shapes policies and political priorities, and finally, the impact of these particular discourses on migrants' everyday lives.
To answer these questions, we have two guests. Bastian Vollmer, Professor of Social Sciences at the Catholic University of Mainz and coordinator of the work on narrative and discourses on irregularity for the ICLAIM project, and Michele Levoy, Director of PICUM, a network of 160 member organizations who work to ensure social justice and human rights of undocumented migrants in Europe and internationally.
Let's start with hearing from Bastian Vollmer about the findings from ICLAIM research on narratives on irregular migration in Europe.
So welcome, Bastian. Thank you for taking the time to talk to us today about the work you did for the ICLAIM project. You coordinated a work package on narratives and discourses around irregular migration. Can you maybe explain to the listener why, in the first place, it's important to know about narratives around irregular migration?
Well, thanks, Ilse, for having me. So understanding the narrative surrounding irregular migration, I think, is crucial because these discourses, which consist of narratives, shape public perceptions and opinions. So when you talk to someone or you read a text or you listen to a narrative on a particular topic, it will add a new piece of understanding on this particular topic. And therefore, your understanding of this topic has somewhat changed, right? So in one way or the other, but the big question is here, of course, how has it changed? So which specific narratives can influence or tweak certain understandings about certain topics? And obviously, bearing this in mind, narratives similarly shape not only opinions and perceptions, but also, and I think consequently, policy decisions and ultimately also electoral outcomes. So we look at media as well as political actors, they use narratives strategically, right, to frame migration or irregular migration as either, for instance, security threat or humanitarian crisis, or as an economic issue, and by that, influencing how societies or groups in societies respond to migrants and understand the phenomenon of irregular migration. So this way, I think narratives are very important. And when we look more closely to our data, the way irregular migration is discussed and made into narratives often determines whether policies prioritize enforcement and border control or focus on integration and rights-based approaches. So what we found when we look into our research and data For instance, in Germany, the discourse around migration is currently intertwined with economic and labor concerns, where when you look into other countries, for instance, at Poland or the UK, you would rather find securitization that dominates and reinforcing as well restrictive border policies. And obviously pointing here maybe out Germany, and given the recent German elections, we have really seen how narratives around migration can be instrumentalized to influence voter sentiments, and particularly by parties seeking to capitalize on anxieties related to migration. So looking at our work analysis, I think we highlight that migration is framed very, very differently across European nations. So in some cases, you find political actors and media that emphasize crisis narratives, portraying migration as an urgent problem requiring immediate containment, right? But then in contrast, you look into the civil society organizations, and they often counter the dominant discourses that we found advocating for rights-based approach or highlighting migrants' contributions to society. But importantly, this divergence, in these narratives and discourses that we have found, they actually lead, I think, to polarized policy debates that we can observe in many countries around Europe, where in the end, as we can observe, securitization measures overshadow discussions about legal pathways, economic participation, and social integration. But I think, and this is based on our stuff we have looked at, by critically engaging with these narratives, I think policymakers, as well as the media and civil society actors, I think they can actually foster more balanced discussions that transcend this short-term crisis management and promote sustainable migration policies. And this is basically what we're hoping for.
Yes. Can I ask a follow-up question on this critical engaging with narratives? Because as you now pointed out, we saw a lot of variety between the different European countries. But something that also struck me from the reports is if we look at the political discourses around irregular migration, we also see what media scholars call double speak. So like language that in a way deliberately obscures or disguises the meaning of words. So you were now referring to the maybe security framework, but what is underneath some of these discourses? Can you maybe give an example to the listener what the wider implications of these so-called double speak is?
Yeah, so double speak, what it actually refers to is the strategic use of ambiguous, misleading, or contradictory language that obscures, reframes, or justifies policies that are actually often make harsh and controversial actions, but that appear more acceptable or even being benevolent. So one striking example that of double speak in migration discourse is, and that we have found in our data, is the way restrictive migration policies are often framed as humanitarian efforts. So this rhetorical strategy allows governments to justify harsh border control measures under the guise of protecting migrants. And looking more closely at our data, for instance, in Italy that we found and in the UK, policies that criminalize irregular migration and restrict asylum access are frequently packaged as measures to combat human trafficking or prevent dangerous sea crossings. And another example of the UK would be, of course, the UK's Rwanda deportation policy, as we could have been observing, was basically presented as a deterrent to irregular migration, while simultaneously claiming to protect vulnerable migrants from exploitation. So this kind of framing shifts the focus away from the human rights implications of forced deportations and instead portrays the policy as a moral necessity in a way. Also, another example that we found in Poland, their response to the Belarus border crisis, why the Polish authorities framed their pushback policies as necessary for national security. They simultaneously claimed to be upholding humanitarian principles, and this they did by differentiating between deserving Ukrainian refugees and undeserving migrants from the Middle East, Africa, and so forth. So what it does is it produces, in a way, a selective humanitarianism, really, and creates a racialized hierarchy of deservingness, where some migrants are welcomed and others are treated as basically security threats. The wider implications of this practice is actually very significant, because what it does, it normalizes restrictive policies while neutralizing potential criticism by appealing to humanitarian values. And therefore, this double speak does ultimately obscure the real impact of these policies on migrant rights and reinforces exclusionary migration governance.
So in a way, it also misguides and misinforms people. What also kind of struck me from reading the different national reports is that there is quite some inconsistency in how terms are used and terminology. There might be local variation, but there might also sometimes be like wrong interpretation of terms. Can you maybe say something about this inconsistency of the use of words and what that actually means?
That's right. That's absolutely right. The inconsistent use of this terminology, immigration discourse, is a major issue, I think, because, and I have to say, it slightly shocked me in some extent, because this is not a new topic. It is not a new phenomenon. And because of this inconsistency, it creates basically confusion in public debates and influences how migration or irregular migration is perceived as well as governed. So looking at our comparative report, which will be published on our website very soon, it highlights that across European media, terms such as well, illegal migrant, as when you look into the UK, irregular migrant, refugee, asylum seeker are often used interchangeably, and that is the shocking finding. So despite having, as we know, distinct legal and political meanings, and that is highly problematic because those are the connotations with those terms, it confuses people as well as policymakers, right? It basically leads to misperceptions where public discourse conflates all forms of migration with illegality and thereby legitimizing restrictive policies. So to basically address this issue, terminology should be legally based, okay, across political, media, as well as civil society discourses. So referring to a group of people who are on the move, but that we actually know very little about as refugees, implies a legal status which they do not have at this moment, okay? And referring to them moving people as economic refugees implies a motivation that is highly speculative. People just don't know, but they do put this label at, this term. And so alternating terms when referring to the same group, say between migrants and refugees, ultimately blurs the distinction and risks conflating categories. But the larger question here is, I think, Ilse, is when is categorizing people actually necessary and helpful? And then we can ask which categories and labels might be actually used. So I think a key recommendation of our work package 4 is to avoid, this is not a new recommendation because research has confirmed that for many years, to avoid the term illegal migrant because it's a criminalizing connotation, and instead use irregular migrant, which is more neutral. But similarly, I think ensuring that the terms asylum seeker and refugee are used correctly can also clarify legal protection as well as responsibilities under international law.
Yeah.
So and that's the sort of consequent recommendation is that greater media accountability, I think, and training for journalists, and they don't want to hear this now, in migration reporting would also help mitigate these inconsistencies because they're still there, and fostering a more informed and constructive public debate on irregular migration and migration issues, basically in general, right?
Yeah, that sounds like a really important recommendation. It also seems to me that the emphasis on the legal protection seems to disappear a bit from the discourse nowadays. Yeah, so that's important to remind people about the distinctions between the different categories and the legal rights people have. Yeah.
Yeah, I think it's because of the confusion. Just, pinpointing to the right terms and what sort of the right and what it implies using a certain term in certain contexts and in certain, texts that we also looked at, right, in those 3 areas.
Yeah. So I have one final question for you, Bastian, and that's a question that is bringing us back to the topic of labor. So from the research in this work package, it was found that labor is more addressed in some countries than in others in relation to irregular migration. And I just wanted to ask you, I don't know if you can answer the question, but why do you think that irregular migration is more associated with work in certain European countries than in others? Could you maybe, speculate a bit about the reasoning behind?
That is indeed a very difficult question to answer, but I think it occurs mainly due to the highly contextualized environments that we basically looked at in our research. So the prominence of labor-related migration discourse in countries like Germany and Italy compared to its relative absence in Dutch media, for example, might be attributed to, I think, several factors, including economic structures, migration histories, political priorities, as well as political cultures. And looking a bit deeper into the data that we have put together in Germany and in Finland, for instance, irregular migration is often discussed in relation to governance and workforce integration, where migrants are framed as both a potential economic asset and in some cases sometimes also as a burden on public resources. But when you look, for instance, at the Italian media discourse, on the other hand, which is heavily focusing on the exploitation of irregular migrants in agriculture and domestic labor, and I think this is because of the emphasis which is likely due to Italian reliance on irregular migrant workers in low-wage sectors and the actually persistent issue of labor informality. But then, again, in contrast, in Poland and the UK, labor is not a primary focus because migration is largely framed and sort of underscored as a security concern or a matter of sovereignty. So in the UK, media discourses and discussions around irregular migration often center on border control and legality, with irregular migration strongly associated with small boat crossings rather than labor contributions. And similarly, in Poland, the discourse is shaped by, because of the Belarusian crisis, geopolitical concerns, where migration is seen as a hybrid threat rather than an economic issue. And as you mentioned, also the Netherlands, in this context, I think irregular migration is primarily focused as a legal and procedural challenge. The debate rather focusing on asylum policies rather than economic participation. So these differences, nevertheless, highlight, I think that's the last point, highlight how national media landscapes and political priorities shape the way migration is discussed, and consequently, how migration policies are actually then formulated, right?
Yeah, great. Wow. Yeah. So you bring us back to the beginning where we discussed the relevance of looking at narratives, and it has
absolutely
wider implications. Thank you. Thank you so much, Bastian, for taking the time to talk to us. All the reports will be available on our website, including the comparative report. So if people want to read more, they can go to our website and find the report. Thank you very much, Bastian.
Thank you, Ilse, for having me. Thanks.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Bastian really made clear how media and political narratives matters, not only because they shape perception, but also policy priorities. Now let's move to our second guest, Michele Levoy, Director of PICUM. Hello, Michele, and welcome to Mobility Worker Rights. It's a pleasure to have you here on the podcast. The first question I would like to ask you, it's about these crisis narratives that really surround most of the conversation around migration in Europe. We have seen it applied, and often when we talk about crisis, what we are referring to, or what the narrative refers to, is irregular crossings, and we think about the Mexico-US border, the Belarus-Poland, the crossing through the Mediterranean. In what way this sort of, can we challenge this understanding of migration as a crisis?
Very much. Thank you, Nando, for the invitation to join the podcast and to commend you for the work that you're doing in iClaim. I think that what we try to do within PICUM, so we're a civil society network, we focus on the human rights of undocumented migrants. We are trying to show from the ground with evidence, what is the impact of this narrative? A crisis for who? So, for example, we see different types of crises. One could be a crisis of solidarity. We're showing, for example, that people who are trying to provide humanitarian assistance to people who have irregular migration status, whether it's housing, whether it's shelter, whether it's food, they are increasingly being criminalized within the European context. Migrants themselves are being criminalized. We actually do an annual report, and for the one that we finished looking at examples in the year 2023, we found that there were 117 people who were criminalized for these types of things. 8 people who were criminalized for providing food, water, and clothes. And so we see that there's also a crisis of values. Another example that I've seen within our work is what has been maybe a little bit under the radar, but how different EU member states are increasingly trying to increase returns. So to focus their policies on returning migrants. And what does that mean at the national level when you want to increase that? So the Swedish government in June 2022 decided to do a special investigation to look at its legislation to see how to strengthen its legislation to make it easier and faster to return people. So what this meant was they were looking at how there could be public sector workers who would then have to report undocumented migrants if they came in contact with the immigration authorities. And in 2024, so 2 years later, the government released the finding of this long 2-year public inquiry. And it found that 6 public agencies would have to report undocumented migrants. Thankfully, there were 3 that were exempted: health services, schools, and social services, but 6 other ones still have to. And what we found is that on the ground, it was a huge public support against this. There were university teachers, welfare professionals, healthcare workers, teachers, municipal workers, library staff, who all went against this proposal. So in a sense, that's most likely what led to the exceptions, but there should be no exceptions because there should be no proposal for reporting. So, I mean, these are just 2 examples, but this is also what we're seeing. These are also other crises.
The point about the focus on removals is a really important one. I mean, in Britain, since the new Labour government, we have seen a very dramatic increase in voluntary, inverted comma, removals. And it's interesting because it's almost this increase didn't go hand in hand with the kind of a tough talk rhetorics. The previous government was talking very tough, but they had fairly low removal rates. And here we have the opposite, although we have seen that now with Donald Trump coming into power in the US, somehow also the narrative is shifting. So we have seen the videos of deportations being put to the media that we hadn't seen up until very recently. Connected to this focus on crisis, it seems that the irregular crossings are often used as the catalyst event for justifying this narrative of crisis. because obviously PICUM focus on the situation of undocumented migrants, what seems to be happening to me is that the narrative conflates irregular crossings with irregular migrants. What I mean that everyone who entered irregularly is automatically constructed as an irregular migrant. This has got two implications. One is that only the one who enter irregularly are irregular migrants, but also the fact that forget a very important point that people can apply for asylum, etc. What are the consequences of looking at understanding the undocumented migration only through the lens of irregular crossing? Who is left out from this narrative, and what are the consequences on people?
Actually, who's left out is the broad majority of people who have undocumented status, because we've also seen that we've, as PICUM, been involved in two key research initiatives. The one was called the Clandestino Project from about 15 or 16 years ago, that was looking at how people become undocumented. And now MIRAM, which is a sister project to iClaim, is also looking at what are the current data and estimates of undocumented, and how do we look at also other measures like regularization. But what these research projects are finding is that the majority of people are actually regular when they're entering into the EU. They become undocumented. And so I think what we see not only is there inaccurate policy discussions, or maybe too much attention that's focused on borders, rightly so, because we have to have human rights guarantees at borders. So it's not to say that that should ever be underestimated. But the overwhelming majority of people who are undocumented are not having the right possibilities of doing their work and their stay regularly. And so it overshadows other policy initiatives. It makes them invisible in other policy initiatives. So, for example, workers' rights. The overwhelming majority of undocumented migrants are workers. They have to work to survive. And we know from years of reports from the European Fundamental Rights Agency that severe labor exploitation is rampant when it concerns migrant workers. So we know if undocumented migrants are overwhelming the undocumented workers, and research from various agencies and entities is showing exploitation is common, that we have to look, indeed, when we talk about tackling labor exploitation in Europe through various initiatives, it has to also look at undocumented migrant workers. So, for example, the European Labour Authority and other entities at the EU level are thankfully looking into this, but what role do labor inspectors play then in trying to ensure that EU legislation like the Employer Sanctions Directive, which has protections for undocumented workers, is adequately enforced? What role would the European Commission play? Because there is legislation that allows undocumented workers to have back pay. So I think in general, we have to see more visibility, but we also have to see more articulation with other policy areas. Just another brief example. There are many cases of gender-based violence amongst women who have irregular migration status. Many women have spouse-dependent visas, and when a relationship might break down and the perpetrator becomes violent, they might lose that. So we see that this is a reality, yet we don't see the proper recognition and policy or legislation to ensure that people who have irregular migration status can report crimes. So because they are not necessarily as visible, or there might be other motives for trying to make sure that they are not given those guarantees, unfortunately. So for us, it's really trying to show what are the policies that are affecting people with this status in other areas besides migration. How can they be coherent so that as policymakers, you can ensure that you are not undermining workers' rights, you are not undermining gender-based or gender rights across the board for all workers, for all women, etc. So it's coherence as well.
As an organization that works in several countries with several local partners, how do you negotiate the fact that in different countries, who counts as an irregular migrant, who counts as undocumented, may vary? I mean, in terms of legislation, in terms of the public conversation, how do you sort of almost tailor-made your advocacy campaign, your messaging in a situation where the actual subject of your intervention seems to be quite hard to capture?
I think what we've always had as an approach within our work as PICUM, but then also especially what our members are doing on the national level, is to see which areas of policy or legislation are impacting the people that they are working with or that they are concerned with. So we look at workers' rights, we look at healthcare, we look at gender-based violence, we look at the situation of children across the board in child rights policies, but then we also look at all those migration policy areas that concern them. So I also think what's been interesting, we're an organization that's existed for about, a little over 20 years. And in that time period, and we've seen some legislative gains concerning undocumented migrants' rights. And it's been interesting to see like what has been successful, what has been instrumental. So I gave that example earlier about Sweden and this reporting obligation proposal. Sweden actually changed its legislation in 2013 to include a broader set of healthcare entitlements for people who have a regular migration status. And that was basically about a 15-year campaign. But the focus was on individuals. It was on patients. It was really led by healthcare professionals. So what we've found that usually resonates the most soundly and sustainably is to look people as individuals and then to see how they fit into those kind of broader policy areas.
Thank you. And sometimes I was thinking at the British case. So last year we had this Illegal Migration Act that was passed, and in a way almost sanctioned within the legislation the use of a specific term, illegal migrants. And from the research we have carried out as part of the Acclaim project, what has emerged? We looked at the narratives in policy and narrative, the media and the policymakers, etc. And the fact is that illegal migrants is by far the most commonly used term to refer to undocumented migration in the debate. And other terms like undocumented, irregular, precarious are used often by the civil society, but not necessarily by politicians and the media. And I was wondering so some of this victory we talked about sometimes can be also reversed, because then you have a government coming in place and then suddenly the conversations shift again towards other terrain. I wonder how do we sort of try to talk to the people, let us understand our messages, as I say, in a way you already answered also to this, at the same time not start to use ourselves the term illegal migrants.
Yes, unfortunately, this is also the issue of this word illegal has been something that we've been looking at almost since the beginning of our organization. And we see that it's really, in the beginning when we were looking at it, it was kind of, I don't want to say innocence, but we don't know how to translate it. So then we worked on a leaflet and we translated in all the UN languages, which include all the EU ones. Well, not all the EU ones, but the EU and the UN languages. We translated irregular or undocumented so that there would be no excuse about not knowing the word. So we know the exact words, we don't, so that's not necessarily the excuse in English or in other languages, but then how to get beyond this reflex that might happen when people think, how do I explain this? I think what we've also been looking at within PICUM is how do we focus more on people? Indeed, people who have undocumented status are within the migration legislation. So you have to resonate somewhere with the fact that migration is part of it. But at the end of the day, we're also talking about people. I think that when you look at how people, to me, what's the most inspirational is how individuals in society in general see this issue, because they, at the end of the day, look at people. So that to me is what I've seen across these years, is all these campaigns that people do that's probably led from the migration sector, but that have broad societal support. And it's because they see at the end of the day individuals.
No, thank you. That's the question came because we are running a survey on public perception on irregular migrants, undocumented migrants, and one of the questions that came very often was, well, how can I ask about public perception on a group that people not necessarily recognize? So that was kind of the thinking. But on the other hand, you don't want to reinforce the stereotypes by using the terms. And as you point out, often the organizations that do campaigning for migrant rights, they sometimes prefer just to go around completely to the question of legality, irregularity, and look at people as human, as workers, as parents, as children, etc. Okay, so Michele, thank you very much for joining us in this conversation, and it's great to have you in the series.
Thank you so much, Nando. Look forward to continuing to engage on these topics together. Thank you.
Bye bye.
Bye.
Maybe not so surprising, but still very important finding is the dominance of the word crisis in the current discourse on migration. An example that is currently all over the news is the small boat arrival discourse in the UK. Nando, can you maybe say a little bit more about this particular discourse to our listeners? And when we think about how to reframe this discourse, what can we do?
Yeah, these are all good questions. Maybe the starting point, from our finding is this. When we looked at the narratives on irregular migration in Europe, the crisis was a key point, a key question, a key term in these narratives. And the other one was this small boat irregular crossing, as if migration is only constructed through this idea of irregular crossing and irregularity. And then the border became a central place where irregular migration is located. What we want to try to do is to understand what kind of things this narrative does. In what way approaching the issues of irregular migration through this angle shapes our understanding of the phenomenon, our responses to it. Perhaps, first of all, one thing we should notice and think about is, by talking about irregular migration only in relation to irregular crossings, we are almost implicitly moving the problem outside our border. Okay? It becomes an issue of externalization, policing, border control. But another important thing it does is who is blamed for this problem? Because immediately identify kind of external actors, for example, the smugglers, the traffickers, enemies that are the cause of the problem. You see that basically what we also know from our research, from our previous work, from work other colleagues like in Mirna are doing, is that in most countries, the majority of the irregular migrants or people with irregular status are actually came in regularly and they have overstayed their visa or they failed to renew their visa. So they became irregular through administrative routes rather than by entering irregularly. Okay, so this is where I think the work we are doing can really have an impact. And I was thinking about this issue in particular yesterday, where I was in Brussels for the Ideas Lab, an event organized every year by CHEPS. CHEPS is one of our iClaim partners. The topic of the panel where I was participating was legal migration pathway to Europe, policy and reality. And it was really interesting because if we approach the issues of irregular migration from the perspective of legal pathway to migration, you see something different emerge. Because then what we wanted to point out, or what we can point out with our work, is, for example, the fact that a lot of the people become irregular because of the requirements, the cost, the condition that are put on the regular status. No? It's about what are the conditions that the visa asks people to comply with. And what are we seeing, and this is my impression, particularly from the UK, that this condition and this requirement and this cost are becoming more and more difficult to overcome for the migrant and putting very strenuous condition on there. Is this the case also in the Netherlands?
Yes, it's the case in the Netherlands, and also following up from your analysis that there is so much focus on the border and on the outside. There is very little discussion actually on the presence of irregular migrants in the Netherlands. So one of the most surprising findings from the discourse analysis that was done in the Netherlands was that work was actually not mentioned a lot. So irregular migrants are not associated with work. They are associated with people who enter in irregular ways, people who are smuggled, people who are contained in shelters, who live on benefits, very a very passive idea of who an irregular migrant is. So the fact that they actually contribute to the economy, that they're part of the society, is something that was surprisingly absent from the discourse. And I think that's an important finding, because it tells us a lot about how irregular migrants are perceived. And eventually it also has implications for policy and politics. So if there is less attention to irregular migration and work, or if the attention is always focused on control, it means that it has a very different framing. It, for example, there is less focus on protection and the rights of the workers. The iClaim project is now in the third data collection stage, and we're also doing ethnographic research with migrant workers in 3 different sectors: agriculture, domestic work, and food delivery. And the findings from the work on the narrative, do they resonate with what we emerge from the field work that we're doing on the ground? Nando, can you say something about the connections and the links?
This is something very interesting, because obviously our research is with migrant workers. So already our starting point, in a way, challenge one of the key pillars of the narrative. We don't work with people crossing the border. We are not working with people just arrived in many ways. We're actually working with people who live in our societies. They work as the majority of people who are undocumented. So the starting point already, in a way, is itself a challenge to the narrative. But the other thing that is emerging and is interesting, it's this idea of how the immigration regime produce irregularity. A couple of weeks ago, with our UK team, we went to visit an organization that provides legal support migrants, legal advice in Birmingham. And this organization, every single morning in the week, has got hundreds of people queuing outside, waiting for them to open their offices to ask for advice. So what we did was asking the caseworkers, who are these people? I mean, who are the people queuing outside? Are they undocumented migrants? And they said, no, these are all people that got visas. But in reality, what he said, every migrant nowadays is precarious and at risk of becoming irregular. So this is really resonate with this point we were making earlier about the production of irregularity as a result of the migration regime. And what he noticed, and what the fieldwork is confirming, is that the situation is becoming more and more onerous and heavy on the migrants in terms of the requirement. At an event I went a couple of weeks ago, an event I went last week, there was a migrant worker from Brazil who spoke on the panel, and she got a master's degree, she's a financial advisor, and basically she said, look, I have, in my family, we have 2 children, we have both parents work, we have fairly good work, but we had to basically do crowdfunding in order to pay the cost, the thousands of pounds that we have to pay to the British government in order to renew our visa, to secure our position in the country. So basically, this is really telling, because this requirement put people in debt, and a lot of people cannot cope with them. They simply cannot cope with this level of debts. They make people more vulnerable in the workplace, because they become more exploitable. They cannot basically speak out, because if they lose a job, they're really in trouble. So this is where I think we are really trying to make a mark with our research. No, I think what we are seeing in the Netherlands, Ilse.
Yeah, we're seeing a similar thing. But also I was thinking, listening to you, that when you look at the discourse around irregular migration, it sometimes seems as if irregular migration or irregular migrants are a very clear-cut category. So the way it's presented in the media is as if it's very clear who is an irregular migrant. And I think our fieldwork is also showing the diversity within this group, all the different stories and experiences that people have, different migration histories, different work experiences, different life experience. And as you say, people can end up becoming irregular, and even before they become irregular, they can already be in a very precarious situation. And this can be because they lose their job or because their relationship ends. And I think that the link with the discourse is that the fieldwork really shows that the stories are very diverse and also very human. So you better understand how people actually end up in a situation like this and what the real implications are of not having this stable legal security. And these are stories you don't read a lot about in the news. So I think there is a connection, and also there is a very important role that we can play to bring out different stories and different experiences with our ethnographic work. And I think there is even the risk of not being irregular yet. There's also the risk of being perceived irregular. So I just heard a story, somebody told me yesterday, that a friend who spoke Spanish in the streets in an American city was arrested and put in custody with her child, so a mother and a child, just because they spoke Spanish and they had legal documents. And I think this is another example where perceptions and discourses around who irregular migrants are, or how they look like, or what language they speak, can have real life consequences. So I think it also shows how important it is to look at narratives and discourses, and hopefully also maybe think about ways how to change narratives.
And in an episode in the future, quite soon, we're going to present the findings of our survey on the perception of irregularity in the public in 6 countries, which will add another element to our jigsaw. So I really look forward to the possibility to share with our listeners our findings on the perception of irregularity.
Yes, great. So thank you for joining us for this episode of Mobility, Work and Rights, the iClaim podcast. To make sure you don't miss any episode in our series, including the one on our survey, please subscribe on your favorite podcast provider or join iClaim mailing list on our website, www.iclaim.eu. We'd love to hear your thoughts on today's episode, so please share your comments and questions with us via our website or social media.
From me, Nando Sigona.
And me, Ilse van Liempt. See you next time.